how far we'll go this week, but this will probably get us through 2 weeks, and it's the one with the map on the top. And then late last night, as I was going through my lesson, I had an uh-oh moment. There were some pictures that I forgot to put in the outline, and so this morning I got up and I printed them off. So this is the addendum to your notes right here. It was uh-oh enough to, thought it was a really neat thing for you to see. Biblical archaeology. So if you look at the handout that you have, there's a map, and it shows some cities you might be familiar with, and this is the Middle East, the area that we'll be talking about, the Mediterranean Sea, and so I'll be referring to places on that map. Last spring, I went to Biola University to take a class on biblical archaeology, and it appealed to me because, for one, I am passionate about Christian apologetics, and this was offered in their apologetics program, meaning looking at confirming that the Bible is true. That's what apologetics is. And for another reason, I did not know too much about archaeology. So I'm not coming to you as much of an expert on archaeology, but I am and always have been passionate about reading history. And so this was, I was able to add to my historical knowledge with biblical archaeology. So archaeology is the study of man-made relics from the past. When we see things that people have made in past cultures, we're able to learn about those cultures. We're able to learn about history. You might hear an argument that goes like this. Some people say the Bible is unreliable because all the places and people that it talks about have not been found by archaeologists. This is the kind of comments that I read from the smart people on the internet. And what you should know, first of all, is that is the idea that we haven't found any of these places mentioned in the Bible. That is an argument that was formed in about the mid-1800s, when there had not been too much archaeological discovery. From the late 1800s to the mid-1900s, there was a flourishing of archaeology, particularly in the Middle East, where in that time they found lots of stuff that confirms the Bible. And this always reminds me of Indiana Jones. That's what he was, that took place during that time period when biblical archaeology was flourishing, 1930s or so. And so Indiana Jones was looking for these things, the Ark of the Covenant, and the Holy Grail in the third movie. I never watched the second movie, nor do I care to. But anyway, so he was interested in these things. So anyone using that argument that we haven't found any of those things so we can dismiss the Bible is just spouting a very old argument, a centuries-old argument that has been debunked for nearly a century. Some more specific arguments that I hear and read go something like this. Some people say Jesus, David, and Solomon never existed, that they were inventions. Some people say the Israelites never had an exodus from Egypt, that was a myth. A lot of people say the flood certainly never happened. And I'm wondering, have you come across any statements like that in your life and dealings? That this never happened in the Bible?
Because the flood, yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah.
Recently been discovered David. Has that been a recent discovery? Some evidence of David?
Yeah, well, they've had evidence of David for close to a century, but yeah, recently, stuff. They've been, in the past few years, I remember reading from time to time about inscriptions with, King David with his name, and we'll be talking about those discoveries, In this series, I want to show you specifically what things have been found in order to strengthen our faith in the truthfulness of Scripture, and maybe to strengthen somebody else's faith, someone who's heard these arguments and not quite sure about the truth of Scripture. As we go through them, I'll read relevant portions of the Bible, and I'll show you the archaeological discoveries that corroborate the biblical narrative. Archaeology has another use beyond confirming the Bible. Through archaeology, we learn more about the times and the cultures in which these stories took place. So it brings it more to light when you read about Abraham, when you read about David, to actually have a sense of what was their day-to-day life like. What things did they have around the house? How did they live their lives? So archaeology helps us to get a sense of what was their life like. prior to the great archaeological discoveries that began in the late 19th century, there was little evidence to corroborate the Bible's historical statements. And critics would dismiss the narratives by saying they're implausible stories set in fictitious backgrounds. But by the mid 1900s, it was clear that these were real places. These things you read about in the Bible, they were real places. They were real people. They were real historical events. And archaeology has been backing up the biblical record. In this series, I don't know how long this series is going to go. I vaguely signed on to do about a 6-week series, but I don't know how long I'll go. I don't even know how far I'll go today. But maybe about 6 weeks, maybe 8, I don't know. But I'm going to go in order of the Bible, which is more or less in historical chronological order. So I'm going to start with the Old Testament, actually looking at the flood, and go on towards into the New Testament. So any questions before we get started on the flood? Okay. I don't have any specific archaeological evidence of the flood. There's no, any remnants would be, it'd be neat if they found the ark. I don't think they will. But that would be a great archaeological testament to the flood. But what we do have, corroborating that this flood, this great flood actually occurred, is, some people might say, well, the flood, that's just one of those fairy tales in the Bible. It never really happened. You have to understand that cultures around the world, many ancient cultures, have a story about a flood or a disaster that wipes out pretty much all of mankind. Stories around the world have this. Now, one example, and I think I have, where's my hand? I'll just take this. Atrahasis. This is a story that was written roughly 1900 BC. So putting this in chronological perspective, again, not that the flood happened then, this is a story that was written then. So this would have been around the time Abraham was alive. This story written in 1900 BC, and you can see a tablet that's in the British Museum on page 2. It is an Akkadian and Babylonian epic of the Great Flood. And now in this story, this Great Flood was sent by the gods, because they weren't monotheistic, they didn't believe in God, but sent by the gods to destroy all human life. So this is a culture different from the Israelite culture that has this story about a great flood. Now the Akkadian Empire, they were the first ancient Semitic-speaking empire of Mesopotamia. So by Semitic-speaking, I mean there's a family of languages called the Semitic languages, and that would include Arabic, Hebrew. Looking at the linguist here. Arabic, any languages from that Middle East area. Now, in this story, one man survives, kind of like Noah, and in their story, his name was Atrahasis. Atrahasis heeded the words of this god who had come to warn him to build an ark, and so he loaded 2 of every kind of animal into the ark, and so preserved human and animal life on earth. Now, keep in mind, this is a story. If it was written down about 1900 BC, who knows, how many centuries or millennia passed since the flood? We really don't know the timing of the flood. But many millennia passed, and this would have been an oral tradition until it was written down in about 1900. So the story gets passed on, names get changed. We know that we have a truthful account in the Bible because the Bible is the one example where God actually spoke directly to Moses. So it doesn't matter if it happened a million years prior. God spoke to Moses and said, here's what happened. Here are the names involved. Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth. Here's where it happened. So God spoke directly to Moses, so Moses had the story right. All these other stories were an oral tradition for perhaps millennia before they got written down. So you would expect that details were changed. But listen to how close this sounds to the story as we know it that's in the Bible. Mm-hmm. One man was warned by a god to build an ark, that a flood was coming. By the way, the flood was coming because the gods were mad about people and they just wanted to wipe them out. Now, oftentimes in these stories, because you're going to hear there are a bunch of stories like this, the gods are mad at the people for what I found two main reasons. One, either the people are wicked, or in some accounts, the people were too noisy. I hear there was a movie that came out and he was mad because they were poachers, they were killing animals. Well, that makes sense because then he killed the animals. Anyway, so the movie with Russell Crowe.
Yeah.
Okay, so one man survives. I don't recommend it. Didn't even see it, and I don't recommend it. One man survives. His name was Atrahasis. He heeded the warning of this God who told him to load 2 of every animal onto the ark, preserve human life. Now, here's some elements of the story. The gods wanted to destroy everybody. The humans that then, after Atrahasis survived, how did they get more people out of that? Because he didn't have a wife in this story. Humans were made out of clay from the earth. One god, as I mentioned, warned and instructed to build a big boat. The flood, okay, in this story, the flood was due to overpopulation and noise. So the gods were mad because it was too noisy. They couldn't nap or something. I can relate. And there were 7 days of rain instead of 40 days, but 7 days of rain. Now again, this is important to know because to see this is not just a Bible story. This is a story that in our collective conscience in the world, this is a story that's been passed down in different cultures. In addition to the Atrahasis story, there's also the Sumerian flood story. Totally different. They're all from that region, but this is a different culture. The Sumerians, they wrote down a story in about, we have tablets going back to about 17th century BC. The Sumerians have a flood story, and I don't have any details on that because you get the point. There's also the Epic of Gilgamesh from that area, written down perhaps as early as 2150 BC. The Epic of Gilgamesh is about a man who, as Noah did, who survived a flood. He was warned by the gods that a flood is coming because a flood is going to wipe out everybody because of wickedness or something to anger the gods. And so he built a boat and escaped from that flood, and people were able to repopulate. A fourth story, the Roman poet Ovid, he wrote the Metamorphoses. He wrote a lot. I remember when I took Latin in high school, we studied, 4th year Latin class was all about reading Ovid's poetry. One of the story, and a lot of the mythical stories that we know in Greek and Roman mythology, Ovid was the one who wrote them down. He wrote one story about a couple, Deucalion and Pyrrha. Deucalion was the man, Pyrrha was the woman. And in this story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the world was destroyed by the gods with fire because of discontent with mankind. So the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, they have a similar story. And again, it was passed down by oral tradition for who knows how many millennia until Ovid wrote it down, put it in print. Deucalion and Pyrrha were more righteous than others. And I just want to make sure, okay, reading the right page. And so they were saved. Now, in this story, just to show you the differences in the stories from what we know in the Bible and from the other stories, Deucalion's father was named Prometheus. He was a Titan named Prometheus. And in their mythology, Titans were basically like gods, but better. He was warned by his father Prometheus that he needed to build a boat to survive a flood that was coming. Now, a minute ago I said the world was destroyed by fire, and here you have divergent stories. Some of the story involves, or different versions of the story involve fire, some involve a flood. But in one particular, the one that Ovid wrote down, there was a flood coming in addition to fire. And that Zeus, the head god, was going to punish mankind for their wickedness. So Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, they survived for 9 days of the flood before landing on a mountain, Mount Parnassus. They were all alone in the world, and so they wanted to repopulate, the world. And so one of the goddesses in their mythology, she told them to, in order to create new people, to take the bones of their mother and throw them over their shoulder. And they're like, what are you talking about? The bones of our mother. Well, they realized, oh, we're talking about Mother Earth here. And so they picked up rocks, threw them over their shoulders, and then people appeared from those rocks. The ones that Deucalion threw became men. The ones that Pyrrha threw became women. That's the story. Why is this interesting to me? There is a common thread of people being made from the clay of the earth. This common thread throughout all the stories, including in the Bible, there's this common thread, people being made from the earth. So interesting to see these divergent stories, and yet there are many similarities. Any questions so far? Anything I've covered? Okay. Egypt also has an ancient story of the destruction of mankind by their chief god Ra, and it doesn't share as many similarities as these other ones, but all throughout there are these stories in these different cultures, something about a universal destruction by the gods. A big idea here is in a variety of ancient cultures, there was an oral tradition of the destruction of mankind, usually by a great flood, attributed to God or gods wanting to wipe out mankind, through which a very small group was saved. Okay, so that's it about the flood. That's what we have. Any questions so far? Okay. Ella? All right, driving on. Yes?
In this tablet, does it explain that there was a flood? There?
Yes, in the Atrahasis, it tells about, of course I can't read that, especially not in this, I don't even know the language, it does tell about the flood. That's where we know this story from, by reading that tablet.
Okay.
Yes. It's much bigger than in the picture. It's like the Mona Lisa over here. Anyway, it's a big tablet, yes. Okay, what do we have next? The Patriarchs already, okay. So the Patriarchs, if you look on the front page of your handout, page 1, under the map, I've listed out for you, you'll hear me say and you'll read about the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Different parts of the world experienced a Bronze Age and an Iron Age in different centuries. But this is more dealing with, in this particular region, the Mesopotamian area. And so, as far as I can tell, it breaks down to these centuries. Now, keep in mind, if you do a Google search and you find the Middle Bronze Age, no, that actually was only 1400 BC, and I wrote 1500 BC. Keep in mind that historians, when they list out when eras begin and end, it's not so fine as, it's not as if they stopped using bronze in a middling sort of way in exactly the year 1500 BC. So these are roughly the time frames. So if I refer to the Bronze Age or the Middle Iron Age, you'll have a rough time frame of when this is. Okay, so back to it. The time of the Patriarchs is when historians refer to as the Middle Bronze Age, which was about 2000 to 1500 BC. Biblically, what we call the patriarchal period goes from Genesis 11, from the time of Abram, to basically the end of Genesis. Now, going back to how I started this class about these ideas that the Bible can't be relied upon, and that was 19th century thinking that has since been debunked, it is noteworthy that there was in Germany in the 19th century, and I don't even remember the fellow's name who started it, but it was called the documentary hypothesis. And there was a historian who speculated that Moses, in about we're talking about the 1400s BC is when Moses lived. Moses could not have possibly written the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Pentateuch. He said Moses couldn't have possibly written it because they didn't have writing back then. And certainly they didn't have such detailed concern for the things that you read in the Torah, such as details about law, what to do with, there was a criminal code in the law, all the things you read in the law. They said they didn't have writing back then, and they weren't that sophisticated to come up with those laws. So that was pre-archaeology. That was 19th century. And now it's kind of laughable, all the things that we've come up with. I mean, I've already shown you writing in those tablets from many centuries before Moses. Yes, there was writing back then. The Code of Hammurabi, I remember reading about back in middle school, world history class. We now have plenty of writing that predates Moses by many centuries. But yet, they didn't have that at the time, in the 19th century. So this historian speculated, well, Moses in the 1400s BC could not have written the first 5 books because nobody could write back then. So he came up, and by the way, he was not a believer in the Bible, and I really believe that these things, there's so much speculation, I believe that he was basically trying to discredit the Bible. But he said, the Bible was written, or the first 5 books, the Torah, were written by 4 different authors over many centuries. And he broke it up into 4 different authors. And it's known as the documentary hypothesis, but it's also known as the JEPD hypothesis. So JEPD means some of the authors, many centuries, actually a millennium after Moses, were the Yahwists, or the Jehovahist writers. And they were the ones, we know who those ones were, because whenever the Bible writes about Yahweh, and in German, back then, 19th century, Jehovah was how it was pronounced, but they were the Jehovahist, or the Yahwists. And then sometimes the Bible refers to God as Elohim. So those writers, or that writer, was the Elohimist writer. And then there are some books that have specifically to do with priestly duties. Not books, but some parts of the Torah. Priestly duties. So those were the priestly writers. And then some books writing specifically about the laws, those were the Deuteronomical writers. And so there was this theory that there were at least 4 different writers, or 4 different groups of writers, who put the Torah together about a millennium after Moses lived. So the biblical authors, lost my page here. Again, it was based on speculation and the 19th century belief that the writing would have been too primitive to write these things, and their methods of documentation too primitive back then. But this theory directly contradicts the claims of the Bible writers themselves, and since that time, the reasonings, the basis for those speculations have been debunked, because we found in cultures in the Mesopotamian era, there was plenty of writing, and there was plenty of detailed laws and the kinds of things that you read in the Torah. Talking about how the Bible contradicts the idea that Moses did not write the Torah. From Joshua onwards, much of the Bible asserts it. I didn't write down, I just wanted to save on ink, I'm sorry, but if you want to see afterwards, I have about 20 different passages throughout the Bible, starting with Joshua, going through the New Testament, Jesus saying, and Paul writing, specifically, Moses gave us the Torah. The biblical authors, along with Jewish teachers such as Philo and Josephus, and the fathers of the early church, they all believed that the Bible was written down in the time of Moses, that it was written by Moses himself or by scribes under his direction, and that it can be regarded as reliable transmission of God's word communicated through Moses. So everybody throughout history in the church and in the Jewish communities believed that Moses did write it, and then suddenly this fellow comes up in the 19th century and says no, because we don't have archaeological evidence. And now we found that archaeological evidence. So if we had had the archaeology back then, this hypothesis would have never appeared. All right, questions on that while I take a break? All right.
What hypothesis wouldn't have appeared without the archaeological?
Oh, the documentary hypothesis, the JEPD.
Oh.
Yeah. And you still see, sadly, in secular historian circles and archaeology, you still see that going on. It's like, it was the hypothesis, the documentary hypothesis was debunked, but no reason to give it up, right? Because, I mean, that's the reason, I guess. They're like, well, it's been a good hypothesis. It hasn't been disproven. So let's just go with that. So you still see that being bandied about, not just by those whom I sarcastically call the smart people on the internet, but that is the dominant thinking in secular history, that, yeah, it was probably written about 1,000 years after Moses. No proof, and what that was based on has been debunked, but yeah. Critics say that the Torah was written at a much later time, and specifically they say during the Babylonian captivity, which, you know, we're talking now into the 6th, 5th century, around that time BC, about a millennium later. They say because there are anachronisms in the Bible. We'll address those, if not today, then in future weeks. That there's no evidence for these places or cultures. Well, that has mostly been debunked. That writing and legal processes and customs in the Torah were too advanced for that time. And again, archaeological discoveries have done away with those, or should have done away with those arguments. They also say that the reason that the Torah was written, and by Torah I mean everything Genesis, the first 5 books of the Bible, is that it was fabricated in order to establish, it was basically propaganda, pro-Judea and Israel propaganda. It was fabricated to establish a kingdom of Judea, meaning the Israelites were in captivity, they were in Babylon, and the hypothesis says they needed to establish that they had a right to that nation, a right to that land. That's still going on how many thousands of years later. They needed to establish they had a right to that land, so they wrote these stories about that they fabricated this history to show that that land always belonged to them. What you'll see is, one of the things to just debunk that a little bit is the things that they wrote. Generally, if you were inclined to write propaganda for your nation, you wouldn't write all the nasty stuff that you find. I mean, there's some bad stuff. The Patriarchs, you read about some of the things Abraham did, and Isaac and Jacob. They did some pretty bad stuff, and we read it and we say, wow, that wasn't really godly behavior. If you're writing propaganda and, you know, writing about your patriarchs, you'll write wonderful things about them. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, any questions? Okay, let's talk specifically about these archaeological findings. I am watching the clock. All right. The first thing, tablets that have been found. Okay, I'm on page 4, the Mari tablets. I'd like you to go to your map on page 1. We're going to do some map exercise here. Oh, good, I lost my copy. If you have a map that has, oh, good, here it is. Okay. And I'd like you to find Mari on it. I circled it in red right here. So you've got your Mediterranean Sea. You've got, in capital letters, Aram. And right next to that, Mari. Mari is along a river that is the Euphrates River. In capital letters, you see Mesopotamia. That's from Greek for in the midst or in the middle of the rivers, between the rivers. But so Euphrates River, that isn't marked. But I hope you can see off of that lower, that southern river is Mari. So you can circle that on your map or whatever you care to do. It's an ancient city located in what's now northern Syria, and it was a thriving metropolis between about 2800 BC and 1760 BC. So now keep in mind the time of Abraham is about 1900 BC. Now picture this. In the year 1933, nobody knew about this ancient city. This was just real estate. This was just empty land along the river. A group of Arabs they were actually going to dig a grave. So they were looking for some nice unoccupied land, and they went to the river and they went to dig a grave. Again, this was in 1933 along the Euphrates River. And as they're digging a grave, they hit something solid, and they pulled it out, and it was a stone statue. And they reported their discovery, And soon a team of archaeologists came and said, what else can we find around here? And they dug around the place, and they found another statue and another statue. And the archaeologists were finding all these statues. And eventually, they kept on digging and digging deeper and deeper, and they found an elaborate royal palace bearing the name of the city of Mari. So it started with these guys just going out to dig a grave, and it became this big site, about 6 acres large, of just a palace that was underground, a buried palace. The palace covered more than 6 acres. It was 2 stories. So we're talking way back then, yes, they had 2-story buildings. It had more than 260 rooms in it. What a great discovery. Courtyards, passages. These rooms had walls 15 feet high. There were spacious living quarters for the king and his family, and more cramped quarters for officials and servants. There was a statue of a bearded man. As I said, there were many statues found, but one in particular, just kind of interesting to me, and this is on the handout that I have there. And this is from roughly the 18th century BC, 1700s BC, inscribed with the name of Ishtupalum, the king of Mari. So you can see a picture of him here. I just think that's fascinating. Went to dig a grave and you find these statues and this king, a city, a metropolis brought up. They also found 20,000 cuneiform, which is wedge-shaped writing tablets from the royal archives. So before nice alphabets that we have were invented, they had cuneiform, just wedge-shaped writing, and you can see what that looks like. About 20,000 of those. So Mari, this area, this palace, was in use from about 2300 BC, so we're talking about 4 centuries before Abraham's time, until its destruction by Hammurabi in 1760 BC. An archive, we find an archive of thousands of texts, about 20,000, from the final years of the palace, and it provides a detailed insight into the common social, economic, and legal practices of that time. So we learn all about this culture by reading these tablets. Of course, it took somebody to know how to read these tablets, but that's the area of linguistics right there. It contained in the archive administrative and legal documents, letters, treaties, literary, and other religious texts. So the value of the Mari texts for biblical studies lies in the fact that Mari is located in the vicinity of the homeland of the Patriarchs. It's about 200 miles southeast of Haran. And so if you go back to the map, and if you're at Mari, and go straight upward about 1 inch on the paper, up and a little to the left, so a little to the northwest, you have Haran. And we read about that in the Bible. Genesis 11:31 says, again, this is Genesis 11:31. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans. Okay, so let's look at the map. If you go right here, southeast, right above and where it says ancient Near East, there's Ur right there, Ur of the Chaldeans, so that's where they started out. From Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, so they went, they followed the river up and got to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years and he died in Haran. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I'm okay with it. It shares a common culture with the area where the patriarchs originated. So that's why, for biblical purposes, this is a wonderful discovery. They live they're within a few hundred miles. It details practices such as adoption and inheritance that are similar to those found in the Genesis accounts. The tablets speak of the slaughtering of animals when covenants were made. So other cultures did these kinds of things. These tablets of Mari also show there were judges similar to the judges found of the Old Testament. It shows that there were gods that are also named in the Hebrew Bible. So our Bible names foreign gods, and these gods are attested to in these Mari tablets. It mentions personal names such as Noah, Abram, Laban, and Jacob. Not necessarily those individuals that we know from the Bible, but at least that these names existed. They weren't names that someone in the 5th century or 6th century BC, when writing a concocted fabrication, made up, yeah, we'll call that person Joseph, we'll call that person Abram. Because they would have probably used 6th century BC, if they were making up the story, they would have used names prevalent to, that they knew about, to that Babylonian culture. But these are names that existed at the time. A city named Nahor is mentioned, possibly named after Abraham's grandfather Nahor, as well as the city of Haran, where Abraham lived for some time. Other cities mentioned, Hazor, Laish. These are all places we read about in the Bible. 2 more and then I'll be done. There was a prince of Mari. His name was Ariuk. And sorry, I didn't write it down for you, but Ariuk, it's spelled A-R-R-I-Y-U-K. Again, A-R-R-R-Y-U-K. He was a prince of Mari, and he might be the Archaeology who's mentioned in Genesis 14. Historians believe he probably is. So Genesis 14 mentions Archaeology, and here we have the Mari tablets mentioning this prince. So the findings at Mari show that the patriarchal narratives we have in the Bible accurately reflect the socioeconomic conditions of that time and place. And I see that it's 9:40, and so we should probably get out of here. Any questions before we skedaddle? You can turn on. Thank you.